This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, everyone. This is me giving the slow start, fade in warning. Hello. Thank you for coming. You've just got me today, so hello. In case you don't remember me from last time, my name is Lauren. I am one of the tutors for this subject. Most of you would have last seen me during week 6 talking about backlash, and I framed that as sort of a part 1 of 2 of my 2 lectures for this subject. So today is going to be covering some ground that we've covered from a different perspective, so it will give you another inflection to your existing framework. There will be some isms and terminology and so on in the first half, and then we'll move to applied ideology in the second half. So today there's quite a bit on. So thank you for coming. And thank you for listening, to those of you who are listening. I'll see if we can squeeze in a 5-minute break, because I think we can, to sort of come up for air once we get through some of the tougher ideological stuff. And at that point, you can ask some questions if you don't want to save it to the end either. So we have looked at neoliberalism so far in this subject, mainly in week 4. We worked with the definitions that were coming up in the reading at that point, are sort of placeholder ones. They're sort of quite narrow definitions that have sort of helped develop a particular understanding for the purposes of that week. The goal is this week is to take those and put them in a much bigger context and relate it to pretty much every other week of the subject. Let's see how we can do that. When I was talking about backlash, however many weeks ago, it feels like years, but it was only a couple of weeks ago, I talked about that word as having a temporal orientation to it, so it's a word that implies an attitude to time. Neoliberalism is another one of those words, in that anything with neo in it is talking about basically emulating in some form something that has gone before. So in order to give you a sense of where we're going, this is the map. I will be looking at, as you saw from the title, this is neoliberalism as history and theory. Those of you who are in my tutes will have picked up my sort of takeaway point for most content is that theory comes from history, so you can't separate it out. Theory is a set of ideas that are generalised from history. And so in order to understand neoliberalism as theory, often it is presented in sort of fairly pure forms, as if it's a sort of abstract ideology that didn't come out of times and places and people and culture. However, if you want to understand things, putting them in context is a great start. So we're going to sort of trace the sort of historical overview. We're going to move to some of the major schools of definition of what it is, and then sort of what this means for urban planning and what it means for cities and for the people who live within them. And one of the things that I find particularly exciting, which I'm sure you can all laugh at me about, is the idea that 2007, I mean, I remember it, but it's history. So the global financial crisis is a very interesting historical moment that we're not entirely out of, but it is still history, and so it's something that is worth considering in this subject, because a lot of the material that you look at on neoliberalism doesn't necessarily take into account the fact that we're possibly in a new historical stage of capitalism. We don't quite know what it looks like yet, and that's going to be the most important thing for the context in which you emerge from this degree program and start practicing. So we're going to get a chance to look at ourselves in history, which I would think is fun. You don't have to think it's fun. Hopefully you find it useful. And then there's loads of further reading for you at the end. So the implication of that is not that you have to read all of it, but that knowing that this is something that you might come back to, hopefully if you download these slides, they might help you in second semester or beyond. Because this is a subject that will not go away in your planning studies. So, and if you get lost, here's another bit of a map. This is the stuff that I would say is the important stuff to know for the exam. So please don't leave now. But in terms of, this is the basic framework. So this is the slide to come back to. I have just uploaded them as well, so if you want to have a look as we go, you're welcome to do so. So this is the sort of the punchlines. Not that there are many jokes in here, thankfully. So hopefully we'll circle back around to most of this content as we go through. So, neoliberalism has the word liberalism in it. That means we have to look at liberalism. I know you're probably sick of 19th century Britain. I understand that. However, in order to help sort of reinforce these ideas within a context, this is where we start. Not just because I'm a British historian, but because most of the ideas about how capitalism works in theory come out of an industrial capitalist context, which is a British one. So liberalism as a word is nearly as messy a word as neoliberalism in terms of definitions and understanding. For the purposes of this subject, you don't need to go into this too much. You just need to know what we're talking about in fairly broad terms. And liberalism is basically, the way we're using this word is not at all the way that Americans use it. The way Americans use liberalism has very little relationship to the way that historians or people in the rest of the world use the word. So the non-American use of liberal is discussing a very specific set of ideas that are basically associated with what Marx would call the capitalist class of the 19th century. So it is, if you are looking at the development of history from agrarian feudalism into industrial capitalism, get the rise of a middle class who advocate for particular sets of views that help them, as business owners, advocate for their interests. This includes political liberalism and economic liberalism. These are limited ideologies. They're not the only ideologies and the only belief systems that are at work at this time. So, for example, religion, really huge one. Not necessarily so much now for most businesses, but these are specific ideologies that deal with a particular part of how people conduct themselves. It's an important thing to keep in mind. So political liberalism can essentially, for the purposes of this framework, be looked at in terms of individualism. and the idea that there is a moral good in individualism. This is the John Stuart Mill type of on liberty liberalism that we're looking at here. And that's probably one of the most influential ones for the purposes of us going forward as well. And it's the kind of unregulated free market capitalism that we recognise as being the situation that gives us the overcrowding, the factory problems, the health problems that come to characterise most of the stuff we covered in week 2 and 3, and 4 and 5 and 6. The problems of the city during the 19th century really do derive from this sense that there is a moral good to unregulated capitalist activity, and that therefore the role of the government is not to intervene at all. The role of government is to step in very limited terms, and there is a sort of an ethics attached to that. And then over the second half of the 19th century, you start getting the rise of a range of different disciplines that try to regulate some of these excesses. So the rise of the concept of public health, which we covered in week 2. With all those great cartoons that David had. I only have one engraving, but this is the context of David's much better images. And urban planning is one of these. So the idea that you can regulate the spaces in which capitalism works and regulate potentially use the power of the state, although most of these early urban planning models were suggesting that people with capital are going to be making these changes themselves in their own best interests. So this is the background for the Garden City, for example. This was not a state-planned sort of model in itself. It's why it's full of really boring sums, for example, to sell the idea to business people. So even though it is a kind of socialism and sort of sits in that sort of framework, it's also the kind of socialism that you're sort of, I was going to use the word woke, but I won't, enlightened working class. It's just so cringy when I took all the memes out of this lecture, so just be grateful that I haven't gone there. But the kind of enlightened capitalist classes are supposed to be interested in making sure that their workers don't die and can eat and so on, so that they can continue to make more money. So this is the kind of framework. But this is also the backdrop where urban planning comes from. It comes from a place where there are no regulations, essentially, and it's about the imposition of those in order to curtail and control where capital can do its work in cities and more broadly as well. So that's taken us through a good 150 years of political history in Western Europe. The next big person, who was just a normal sized person but big conceptually, for this subject is Keynes. So if we've got the political and economic liberal period that goes up until the First World War, it's severely shaken by the First World War because that was extremely expensive and killed a vast number of people. Then we go into a sort of a reboot in the 1920s of unregulated capitalism. And all of those sort of Great Gatsby type associations you have about the 1920s are useful here in terms of looking at what capitalism does after the setback, supposedly, of the First World War. So the kinds of excess that you would stereotypically associate with that do have some resonance historically here, because that leads us into the stock market crash of 1929 and leads us into the Great Depression, which is, there had been depressions and recessions before this, but this is really the first truly global, massive depression. I guess I can't find another word, so I'll stick with that. And the important thing to keep in mind, you might remember this from week 6, I hope, is that this has a kind of psychological effect as well, or a cultural effect. So it's an economic thing in the sense that it means that a lot of people don't have food and houses and jobs and so on. Mass unemployment is a massive issue in most countries in the world at this point. But it also leads to a perception that, hey, maybe this isn't working as a system, and we need to think about the way that capitalism is working, the way that the global economy is working. And so at this time you get both the rise of communist parties who are obviously inspired by the successful revolution in the USSR in 1917, what was the Russian Revolution, became the USSR, who are looking at that direction for potential solutions. You also get the rise of fascism in Germany and Spain and Japan. So responding to the same sort of extreme economic destabilisation with a very different polarised set of ideas and beliefs. And in the middle of this you have little Keynes here with who's, I don't know what he's reading, but he's reading something. It looks like he's reading a Spence Holmes story about capitalism. And the main thing to keep in mind with Keynes is that not only that Milton Keynes was not named after him, I wrote 15,000 words on why bad jokes about Keynes are not funny, so I won't give you that here. But that he gave his name to the concept of Keynesianism, which has come up before. And like anyone who gets an ism named after them, the ism doesn't necessarily fully match what they actually said. The important thing for the purposes of this subject is the idea that we need to put the brakes on capitalism to some extent. We don't need to abolish it completely, according to Keynes, but we need to really, the kind of regulation and control that have been experimented with in small stages before this period need to be instituted at a state and at a macroeconomic global level as well. So he's not just talking about his British, he's not just talking about Britain, he's talking about the world at this point. And that the way that we do that regulation is that we use experts, including urban planners, including sociologists, including all kinds of people who have a technocratic knowledge base, who do nothing but study how to do things. These experts are a fantastic resource to help us make sure that the excesses of the 20s and the excesses of the 30s, in the sense of the Great Depression, don't happen again. So it's coming from this never again framework. And Keynes becomes quite popular in mainstream economics over time. In America, America is a very interesting sort of ingrained ideological libertarianism, which makes it sort of sit awkwardly with a lot of the broader economic trends we describe in this subject. But even there, you've got the New Deal idea that the government should provide some level of assistance for people on low or no incomes, which in the context of America is pretty revolutionary as well. But there is a broad progressive consensus developing partly to insulate the state against revolution from either side. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. This gets framed as socialism to the extent, it's often framed as extremely revolutionary. It's also about sort of protecting the existing system to some extent, because we don't want to have a revolution like in Russia. We don't want to have people like Hitler arising. So the idea is if you regulate capitalism and you insulate people from the worst excesses of it, that you can avoid those extremes, and that most vested interests can carry on, perhaps with a little bit more paperwork, but more or less as before. So Keynes is integral in setting up the post-war economic system, which we'll come back to in a minute. What we're getting to here is the small number of economists who were horrified at this idea of increasing regulation, who started to meet together in various groups in the 1930s onwards, and who started publishing as well. And essentially there are a lot of, these were sort of very fringe economic theories. It's hard to stress this enough. The reason neoliberalism is associated with think tanks is because universities didn't want to have anything to do with these ideas. They thought they were ridiculous. And so the idea of the think tank is that we have to have somewhere to meet and do our work because we're that unpopular. That's not a judgment call, that's just a reflection of what 1930s and 40s economic fashion was like at that time. And specifically, these loose group of fringe thinkers, mainly in Europe at this particular point, are horrified at the idea of regulation itself. And where the neoliberal comes from is essentially in referring to the idea that these people in particular believe that the moral framework So not even necessarily the economic framework, but the moral framework of the 19th century state, which believed that no regulation was an ethical, philosophical good thing, is essentially the same, is their value system. And that any regulation is essentially totalitarianism and tyranny, regardless of if it's regulation to do things like stopping people dying or giving them houses or food. That's, from a moral perspective, and even a spiritual perspective, I would go that far. There is something wrong to these people about this. And some of this gets tied into the fears both of communism and of fascism, but they were generally much happier with fascism, as they continue to be. But the idea that doing anything collectively is going to subsume the individual and lead them to be lost. And the other issue is that competition is seen to be part of this moral good. So in this kind of individualistic framework, the idea that people should compete individually against each other to obtain success is seen to have some kind of morally substantive qualities. And so any impediment of that leads to a sort of a social weakening and decay. So you'll note that this is not just a framework that betrays my interest in this as a cultural historian as opposed to an economic historian, but in terms of trying to understand why things happen and why things are changing, I think this is possibly a more useful approach than throwing lots of numbers and graphs at you. So that is explaining my approach here. But this is also something that doesn't necessarily come up much in the planning histories of this period. They're looking at the why is often sort of overlooked. So that's why I'm trying to sort of focus on this, so we can have a sense of that things are not just happening randomly, but there are very specific responses to contexts that are happening here. And so by the time you get to the post-war state, so the end of the Second World War, once it becomes clear to the USSR, to the US and the UK that they're going to win, more or less, they start having some meetings, a series of conferences. One of those conferences is the Bretton Woods Conference, named after where it was held. And essentially what they were doing was meeting to try and work out how are we going to run the world after this is done? What kind of system are we going to put in place to stop this? And just gesturing at the Second World War happening outside. It wasn't quite happening outside because they were out of the way. But the series of problems that particularly involved the Great Depression leading into political polarisation and conflict. And so the Bretton Woods system is a term that you hear a lot. I used it in week 6. If you remember it, you get a gold star. I have no gold stars, but you get one psychologically. And that happens in 1944. So the war hasn't quite been over yet. They're pretty confident they're going to win. And the idea is that we set up a gold standard for which is pegged to the US dollar, and we fix exchange rates so that international currency fluctuations cannot get to the kinds of extremes that they did, and inflation can be controlled. So it's a specifically, and Keynes was the actual delegate for the British at this conference as well. So he's actually there. There's a reason he gets associated with all this stuff, because he was there. I don't know that he even met Stalin, though. Just a thought. Anyway, don't know why, that's just an interesting thing of who met Stalin. But then when you think about the Bretton Woods conferences happening in 1944, you can start seeing these dates are starting to have some significance. So in the same year, you have one of the classics of neoliberal political thinking, which is Hayek. And The Road to Serfdom, this is a very sort of fringe book at the time, but it's responding to, with great fear, to what's happening. And the Mont Pelerin Society is another, it's not really something you need to know about in great detail, but just knowing what it means when it comes up, because it will, particularly if you read any Simon Springer. Mainly he uses it as a slur, which is quite interesting. But they were just a group of people who were meeting to discuss neoliberal ideas and how terrible everything is getting. So it's not necessarily worth thinking about in terms of having a rigorous shared economic theoretical position. It's a little bit more like a book club, a complaining-based book club of economists. And then Milton Friedman, based in Chicago, hence the Chicago School, comes along a little bit later, but essentially is rebooting the same basic principles for the purposes of this subject. But just to give you a sense of the range and the breadth of the types of reaction, there are a lot of people dotted all over the place, but they're not really cohering as a giant movement of opposition. They are very much on the outer for most of this period. So, and this is sort of, once we get to 1944, this is where we can slot in our content from week 5 and week 6, essentially. A lot of our content from week 5, not all of it. But after the Second World War, we have what's called the long boom. You don't need to write all this down. This is just to give you, this is orienting material, essentially. We have the long boom, which is basically a long period of time where the kinds of recessions that were seen leading up to the Great Depression were not occurring. You can see this is the period in which the sort of post-war Reconstructionist welfare state is happening, so in between that 1944 and 68 period here. So that's where British new towns, social housing, all that material, that's where that fits. Once you start into 1968, things start getting a little bit interesting because, well, they start getting interesting a lot beforehand if you're me, but I understand most of you aren't. But for the purposes of this subject, 1968 is where a lot of this backlash type material that we looked at in the readings is starting to come about. And particularly what is being resisted is the paternalistic nature of the Keynesian, the administration of the Keynesian ideas that are informing the post-war welfare state, that are informing the way that urban planning is being practiced at that time. And this year there is a lot of really interesting stuff being published because it's the 50th anniversary of this time as well. And so there's a lot of just cool stuff to look at about Henri Lefebvre and France, for example. It's coming out at the moment. But you start getting, so there's a social, but essentially a left libertarian critique of a more paternalistic left model. So it's still essentially a left critique in general, which is important to note for this stage. So for example, if you remember non-plan, this was very much a libertarian sort of philosophy in a lot of ways, but it is a left one. And it is still very much focused on removing paternalism, but adding in some collectivity and so on. Then things start getting interesting, even more interesting. So the US has been fighting the Vietnam War, which is incredibly expensive. Amongst all the other things that it was incredibly expensive. And from the late 60s, this is putting massive strain on the Bretton Woods system in general. And by 1971, Richard Nixon, who we know from hindsight was the kind of person who liked making these kind of slightly bizarre unilateral decisions, made a slightly bizarre unilateral decision in that he, without substantial consultation or involving people in trying to reform the existing global economic system, decided that he was just not having it anymore and sort of abandoned the gold standard for the US currency and floated it, which is the concept of fiat currency. I'm not going to get into all that because you don't need to deal with it quite so much on that level for the purposes of this story. It's mainly the impact of this and how it's experienced. So we get the start of some really massive global economic destabilisation that sort of snowballs for most of the next 10 years coming out of this. You have the first oil crisis in 1973. So in a precarious economy where all of the rules that were meant to be in place to protect national economies from destabilisation, if you then severely limit their access to the major fuel source, then you have more problems, which create more political problems, and then these continue to snowball as well. So it's just adding in an extra element here. I'm being brought on purpose because in national contexts, these issues play out differently. But in most national contexts, these are the touchstone points of change that do something really substantial. So we're talking about broad global changes, but they do trickle down in different ways on a different level. But in terms for the history of neoliberalism as an idea that appears to be a valid way to run things, the 1973 US-backed coup in Chile is a big one, in that it is an example of one of the many US-backed coups that throughout the Cold War, and to now, they're very good at it. And this is not conspiratorial politics, this is just basic history. But this particular coup was used as basically the Chicago school economists got a free pass to implement their best practice policies in Chile after this coup. So this is a right-wing coup. This is where you may have heard of the disappeared, which is the name for the people who were killed, disappeared by the regime. But in that context, they basically apply neoliberal economic policies as a way of reacting against the previous Marxist regime as well. So it's really the first global model for how you can run a state according to neoliberalism. What that means we're getting to in the next slide, don't worry. 1976, you might remember from a couple of weeks ago, this is the IMF crisis in the UK. And this is the point where in Britain you get the sense of, oh no, the system has failed completely. And is Britain going to fail completely? So there's a starting to develop a sense not only that there is economic instability, but that there is no point in reforming this particular system. So this is the thing, and it's worth keeping in mind. And I think the time period has something to do with this as well. So all of that sort of psychological framework of people who have experienced the Great Depression, who have experienced the Second World War, that's starting to fade by the time you get to the 70s. There is not a sense of imminence of people who have lived through particular massive upheavals. Even though they're living through the Cold War, it's a very different kind of generic background existential threat for most people who aren't actively being attacked at that point. So in terms of what that means for how people approach issues of economics in the state, it's very important. And then you start to get people being elected and people coming to power in a range of other countries who are putting forth as part of their policy base that the post-war state system has failed and must be entirely abandoned and replaced with something else. And not only that it has failed, but that it has been damaging. So there is a sort of a correlation becoming causation thing. So the fact that there are problems means that you sort of have to throw away the whole system at a certain point. And what's interesting historically is, I didn't put this up in the further reading, but if you're interested in looking at how this maps, this cultural response maps against the reality, Colin Hay is a political economist whose work is really interesting on this, who doesn't normally work with issues of culture, but really tries to grapple with this idea of how do we account for the difference between what the numbers say in treasuries and then what people are saying in terms of their emotional responses to things. And so you get this sense that there is a crisis of confidence as much as an economic crisis on paper. And that's not to say that this was an easy economic walk in the park to try and fix. But it's interesting the way in which the ideological response is not necessarily backed up by the numbers. So part of what this does is bring us to a point where we have ideologies coming into place that we can call neoliberalism. So now we are in definition town. Who's read David Harvey other than in the reading we made you read? Do you want to read any other stuff? Yeah? Has anyone read this? There were those sort of like half and half nods, like, yeah, I might have opened it, but I didn't get through it. That's okay. Harvey is interesting because he is a geographer, as we know, in terms of training and background, but his work has evolved over time to really move into the field of political economy. Even with a spatial bent, he calls it a history, it's a work of political economy. I'm not trying to be sort of shady about academic history, it's just that this is, as much as this is a narrative about the past, it's a narrative that is not necessarily based on a huge amount of historical research. Which, okay, maybe that sounds a little bit shady. But in terms of a theory of trying to explain things, it can be quite useful. And the reason I start here with defining neoliberalism is because this is where most people start with defining neoliberalism, particularly in this faculty and this department. So, and maybe it's because it's got a brief history in the start, so you see brief and you think, right, this is going to be all nice and easy. I'm sorry, it isn't. But as a starting point, this is also going to fit most closely with the definitions of neoliberalism we've seen so far in this subject. So the stuff in week 4 is basically operating most of the time within what we can call a Harvey-type definition, which you could also call a classical Marxist definition, because that is essentially one of David Harvey's other strengths. He is known as the guy who, if you want to read Marx's Capital and you want someone to help explain it to you, you go to David Harvey and he helps you do that. With lots of books and YouTube lectures and so on. So that's the background that he's bringing to this context. And Harvey's model is essentially a top-down model. I'm not using top-down in the same way that we talk about top-down planning, but I'm using it so you can understand it spatially. Neoliberalism, in Harvey's case, comes from above. And it comes from economic and political elites changing the way things are done from the top. And what they do is change things in a way, this is the definition from page 2, so he sets it up this way, that the economic and political elites change things in such a way that reflects this belief system, that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterised by strong private property rights, free markets and free trade. So we have a little bit of that language of return coming back in, the idea of liberating. Something has become constrained and we must liberate it. And so one of the other things that's interesting about this is that he views this as something that happens essentially in an economic system where the elites are learning from each other over time. So his main case studies, which you can see on his cover here, he shows them as sort of circulating this elite knowledge within each other. And Harvey is, of course, quite critical of this. And he's quite critical of it from the perspective of what he thinks that it does and how, in practice, it oppresses. Sometimes he uses the language working class, but he also just uses just people as language. He thinks that essentially most people, the 99%, if you want to use the post-Occupy language of Harvey, are the ones who are affected by this. So that's the model of political power that he sets up. The thing about this is a way of looking at things is that it doesn't quite explain how the political elites got to a point where they thought this was a good idea. It also doesn't quite explain why there wasn't massive resistance when they tried to impose these things. So it doesn't necessarily account for why things happen, which is one of the limitations of the Harvey-type model for looking at cities in general, and for looking at history in general. So it's quite useful if you want to look at just economic systems and how they work and policies and so on. But in terms of where those policies come from and why they and how they perpetuate themselves does not always fit neatly within this type of model. And part of this issue is that even though Harvey is a Marxist, he uses the same tools of 19th century Marxist analysis and applies them to now. So he doesn't quite have a sense that there is a different type of capitalist economy working at this point. And so when he talks about neoliberalism as a restoration of class power, he's implying that there's a consistent narrative of class power, and we're just going back and forth on like a seesaw, which is sort of the way that neoliberalism describes itself, but doesn't, again, as we find in general, and we'll cover a little bit in a minute, the way that politicians describe themselves isn't actually what they actually do all the time. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce someone who has a scary reputation. So I've shown him with a picture of a cat because I thought that would make him more charming. Is anyone René Foucault? He's not that scary, I promise. Or were you scared, maybe? He just has this reputation. I think he's quite useful, and I think you should feel lucky that I'm not in charge because I would make you read some. But, so, phew. Foucault does a lot of really interesting things about spaces and cities. And what the most interesting and frankly the most exciting thing about Foucault's work is this concept of the genealogy, which he takes from Nietzsche. And he sort of does a lot of really interesting work of reclaiming Nietzsche from the sort of fascist reading, which is really good. But it's particularly a way, he's very interested in history but doesn't view it himself as a historian. And he's interested in genealogy, so genealogy being the word for family history. And so when you do your family history, you trace things back further and further and further until you get a more complex web of ideas. And there's no origin or no starting point. You just keep going. And so it gives you a way to look at the way things evolve over time. It gives you a way to think about how you, as a person, relate to this context as well. And it helps you locate things in a context in a way which doesn't make things look inevitable as well, because it creates opportunities for change and things. So that's why people who use Foucault tend to be a little bit less fatalistic in their readings sometimes. And so I just really like this quote that I read the other day, so I whacked it in here. One of the good ways to frame when to use David Harvey and when to use a Foucauldian tradition of defining neoliberalism is depending on what you want to do. If you want to talk about the sort of the bare narrative, the Harvey tradition is fantastically useful. But if you want to understand any questions of why, if you want to conceptualise, then the Foucault line helps explain where things come from in a little bit more detail. So the reason I put Foucauldian tradition up is because Foucault these ideas of neoliberalism came up in a lecture series he was doing called The Birth of Biopolitics. And that he doesn't really talk about biopolitics much in that year-long lecture series. He's mainly talking about neoliberalism. They're not separate, and that's a whole other very interesting separate lecture to go into. But he's really sort of sketching things out as they happen because he finds them fascinating. He's not necessarily going into them in a vast amount of detail. Luckily for you and for us as people who think about cities, a lot of people have taken Foucault's framework and run with it and expanded it and updated it to lots of different historical contexts. So the next two slides are two examples of works that have taken the sort of broad approach that Foucault worked on in this lecture series and expanded them into sort of more detailed theoretical frameworks. So the first one, this book is one, if I have, I try to make most people I know read this book. So this may be one that I recommend this to people a lot. I think James Lesh sent me an email the other day that said, can you stop recommending this book to me because I read it when you recommended it to me a couple of years ago. It's like, okay, good. But it's because it's very useful and it's also quite easy to read. Although I did pick a quite awkward definition there, that is not selling the rest of the book here. Basically, the way that I conceptualise neoliberalism is, yes, it's happening from the top, but that's not all that's what's happening. It happens from the top because of a cultural change that has taken place over time. And what that means is that neoliberalism is not just something that's enforced from the top, but it's actually something that pervades every aspect of how everyone lives and conducts their lives within themselves as well. So neoliberalism is not something that's out there, it's in here, it's in us, it's in this room, it's definitely in this university. And more than that, it's a way of being a human subject. So subject to someone who's subjected to power, but also who acts. So we conduct ourselves in neoliberalism according to market logic. We run ourselves like an enterprise, and that is something that builds up over time. And it's only when that's built up enough that political elites are able to run campaigns like Margaret Thatcher did that said the post-war state has failed because it is imposing all these terrible top-down systems on you. We need to go back to being a nation of shopkeepers. You have to have enough people who are going to identify with the idea of being a shopkeeper and running yourself like a small business and having those kind of sort of petty bourgeois aspirations, I guess we could frame it that way. But that norm needs to have taken place to a certain point. And it also explains why this is a really hard subject to talk about, because there is nothing harder than trying to stand outside what you can't stand outside of, because it informs your whole thinking and your way of being. So that's a little bit of, if you find this a difficult body of theory, that's literally because it's the hardest thing to do, is to theorise yourself and your own context, because you're in your context and you're in yourself. Another example, has anyone read Wendy Brown? She's pretty cool. She's been criticised quite a lot because she's a very poetic writer. That may lead her to make some overgeneralisations about things. At the same time, she's incredibly quotable. And she does some really interesting things about looking at how neoliberalism has co-opted feminism, which is very interesting. But just as a way of sort of building on this idea of enterprise logic for individuals. So she uses the Foucauldian term neoliberal rationality. So rationality in the sense of being a way of thinking, and a way of rationalising, and a way of conducting not just yourself but the entire pattern of social relations. And so it disseminates the model of the market, this is her emphasis, to all domains and activities, even where money is not an issue. And I think that's a really important part, because it emphasises that, yes, there is some potential for restoration of class power in thinking about neoliberalism. There's getting a particular kind of laissez-faire capitalism back in control. But it also does a lot of things that historically knew in order to do that. And there are also a lot of ways of just living in the world that we do now, just as normal things going about our everyday lives, that are very difficult to imagine in historical periods previous to this one. And so we have to try and account for that if we're going to try and account for how we plan for people who are very historically distinct from people who have gone before. It also helps account for how neoliberalism is not just something that right-wing political parties do. It is, when something is understood as a norm, it has to be pervasive. And one of the things that happens, particularly in the 1990s, in the further reading there is a book chapter that I wrote about this where I use British TV comedy to explain this. Which is sort of fun if you like 90s British sitcoms. But the idea is that, so maybe, are you guys old enough? Maybe. Do you remember when Tony Blair was elected in 1997? I barely do, if that helps, because I'm not, I guess everyone's my age. That's okay. But in the 1990s, you get a lot of nominally left groups. So Labor parties, the Democrats, this is a characteristic of the Clinton. I hope that's okay. It's okay, we'll cross everything. It didn't crack. That's good. So you get left-wing politicians basically chasing the votes rightward by accepting the main premises of neoliberalism. So New Labour is about, which is the name that they actually use the words rebranding. If you told a 1970s British Labour politician that they were going to brand themselves They would have thrown rocks at you because it would have been that horrifying. But in the 1990s, we have an idea that we can brand labour as a product to sell to people. And as a way that we can do that is by basically accepting that the market is good, and we can just market ourselves as a Labor Party in 1997 by being slightly less neoliberal than the Thatcher and Major governments. This is similar to how Clinton got elected in 1992. So you can have a third way, which basically it doesn't really try to restore anything like the post-war state model of trying to redistribute things, but just takes a little bit of the edge off of neoliberal policies. So this is why you get to a position where there's what could be called a neoliberal consensus in most mainstream two-party political systems. It's very hard to actually find, up until, say, quite recently, very hard to actually find a political group that is mainstream in most countries that does not have some kind of neoliberalism informing what it does. So, the other thing to keep in mind is that neoliberalism as a term and as a way of looking at things is immensely contested. Particularly, and it seems like a great way for an academic to get an article cited a lot is to publish an article which says, why are we even using this term? Because there's one every couple of months. And essentially what the criticism comes down to is that neoliberalism can be defined too many ways. And a lot of the time people don't define things properly. So that means that it's too broad, it's too generalised, I don't know what it means. The idea that neoliberals don't use that term to define themselves is often thrown around as a way of saying that it's not legitimate. I think that I usually have to address this in more detail in say, history department than I do here. But I think that most planning students are aware that most of the language of planning is quite similar to the language of neoliberalism, to the extent that words like sustainability, walkability, livability, resilience, all of these terms that you use are all incredibly vague. They all have competing definitions, and they're all used in a very vague way most of the time. And that the solution to that is to be really clear about what you're talking about. Because there isn't really the same kind of reaction to the word neoliberalism as there is to the word sustainability. People are still using sustainability. There is criticism of it, but it's not anywhere near the same, it's not quite as heated a debate as it is about this particular term. And so I think this is a problem with trying to describe things that are happening right now, especially when things claim to be natural, which we'll get into the next slides. So we're starting really broad and we're narrowing down as we go. So don't worry, there is going to be more detail that's tangible in a minute. But when things claim to be natural and the way just things are, they are going to resist theorising. That's the whole point. So any language that you use is going to feel awkward and is going to be a bit vague and is going to need a lot of work to be precise on. So, I mean, that's obviously my position here, but otherwise, you know, I could get into some really existential stuff about why am I standing here talking to you. But I have put the debates up at the end in the further reading because I think they're quite important. And it's an important practice to familiarise yourself with as well. Like, this is not a language or a framework that we want you to engage with uncritically. There are lots of different ways of looking at things, which is part of the point of this subject. We don't try and teach a narrow, you know, one foot in front of the other history. We're trying to get you to build a conceptual toolkit to engage with things from lots of different perspectives so that when things adapt and change, you've still got those tools to apply. So applying that to this lecture and this content is totally something we would like you to be doing as well. So, I tried lots of ways. I was trying to do like Venn diagrams and stuff, trying to visualise things, and I gave up because my drawing was pretty bad. So what I've gone for is some tables to think about how do these broad understandings of neoliberalism, what do they actually start translating to? And so we'll go through these sort of rhetorical oppositions of what neoliberal politics says it does, and then what it does, and then we'll start moving into some more specific, tangible case studies, which will pull those together. That was a very Foucault hand movement, by the way. It's very hard to find a photo of him where he's not doing that or that. So I should be holding a cat while I do this, just to complete the Foucault trilogy. I should bring a cat to a lecture. That would be great. I don't know. Okay, so some of this stuff will start to be familiar as you start thinking about how politicians talk. So the idea that the post-war state in particular is too big. The state is big. So we need to make it smaller. We need to roll back the frontiers of the state, is the Thatcher quote. There are lots of other slightly less catchy ways of saying it that lots of other governments had. What this means, though, in practice, is quite different. Because one of the interesting things about neoliberal states is that they tend to massively accrue debt. Neoliberalism is very expensive. And they also love a good expansion of department as much as they love cutting them. So neoliberalism in many ways can be understood as a bureaucratic regime in a lot of ways, which is not how it presents itself. But that's because in order to do what it wants to do, there's a lot of work to be done. So for example, if you want to not just privatise your assets as a government, but you want to create new markets where none have existed before, you have to have some kind of state machinery to back that up. If you want to create a situation where universities compete against each other to get money and funding, for example, to get all you here, you have been headhunted by University of Melbourne through marketing to get your money. And so in order to do that, in order to create a system where universities are essentially, they're very elitist previously, but they're not economically competitive in this way, you have to create government systems that control the funding and regulate it and that apply metrics of auditing, for example. And generally the way to understand this conflict between what it says and what it does is to understand for who it is doing these things. So the state is smaller if you're an individual who needs help. If you're an individual who needs housing, who needs healthcare, and you cannot afford it by yourself, the state is very small for you. If you are a wealthy business person with a lot of money, you will find that there are lots of government bodies in place that exist only to assist you. So, and that goes for things like international borders, for example. It's very hard for individuals to move between countries, particularly if you don't have money. But it's very easy for money to move internationally. And it's actively encouraged. This is where the sort of global tax system starts coming into this as well. So related to this is the idea of cutting red tape for businesses. So there's plenty of red tape for people who are applying for disability support pension, for example. There is only ever more and more red tape applied for those people. There's no cutting of red tape for people who are looking to obtain public housing. It only becomes harder and harder. More paperwork, more regulation. Where the red tape is cut is for businesses. And a lot of that red tape is planning red tape. So what you see over the period of time since about the 1980s, depending on which particular national context sort of took up neoliberalism. So for example, if you're looking at Russia, that would be the 90s. And if you're looking at South Africa, that would be in the 90s as well. But the red tape is cut for businesses and the regulation is cut for capital. And this is done because it's seen to be free. So this idea, this is where the moral continuity comes from the early neoliberal thinking. What that means, though, is that because this moral dimension comes into play, that it becomes extremely hard to think about ideas of freedom that aren't freedom in the marketplace. So the language of choice and freedom and being yourself and being an individual is largely about marketisation, which is partly, actually I'll cover that a little bit more in the case study in a minute. But this leads us into this idea of this is natural in the way things are. People in my tutorials have heard some of my take on this before. If you want to describe something as natural, it's usually what you do when you just want people not to debate it. There is very little that you can say is natural about the way people live now. There's nothing natural about colonialism leading to a university being built here in Melbourne, leading to me standing here wearing a velvet blazer, talking to you on infinite numbers of iMacs who are typing away. There's nothing natural about any of this. This is all very historically specific, deliberate chain of events and causalities, which can be traced as a history. Usually when something is framed as being natural, it has no history because it's just the way things are. And so then it's often abbreviated to TINA, T-I-N-A. There is no alternative. Another Thatcher phrase, but it's a deliberately invoked phrase because what it does is it says that none of the political options which came before, specifically the welfare state, are an alternative to this. You cannot resist. This is just how things are. We can't go back to how things were because they were so terrible. This is the framework. And then that becomes a norm. It becomes very hard to think outside of that particular system. So I guess I covered that already. But there's no such thing as society quote is another important one, because thinking about the idea of who you're planning for, historically planning has grown out of an image of the social. If you're now in a particular political time and moment where you're not meant to be looking at collectivity and you're meant to be catering towards individuals who are competing against each other, then you're operating in a context where it's assumed that some people are going to lose. In a competition, competitions rely on people losing. So when you have that metric in all parts of society, it sort of normalises an idea that there is a moral attachment to winning, economically and politically. And it also means that the competitive framework gets built into all other political systems as well. So this is one of the things that really changes the way that planning can be practiced. I won't go into this, but I just wanted to flag this, that neoliberalism is weird. And one of the reasons it's weird, and is the same reason that it's been effective, is that it absorbs a lot of other ideas, including those which contradict it. So we're in a really interesting historical moment, post-Brexit vote and post the Donald Trump election, because economically those things do not make good sense at all. But what we're seeing is a slight sort of mutation in the practice of neoliberalism towards a nationalist version, even though it doesn't actually make good economic sense to do that. So it's a thing to watch, I think, as we go forward. Okay, cities. Thank you for bearing with me as we got to cities, but now we are at cities. So, broadly speaking, if urban planning results or arises as a discipline of knowledge in a context where it's designed to put the brakes on capitalism, essentially, it has to do a lot of changing very quickly in order to survive. One of the things that I look at in my work is how urban planning got used as a scapegoat for the failure of the post-war state in Britain and in Australia. So, for example, if you want to understand why the former planning minister, Matthew Guy, spent so much time and energy going on about how much he hated brutalist architecture, It only makes sense if you put it in the framework of certain kinds of architecture and urban planning became associated with socialism of the post-war model. I mean, to be fair, it probably doesn't even make that much sense then, but that's been quite generous. So when the definition of how capitalism works changes, when the definition of what the state does changes, and when the definition of what regulation by the state does changes, that has massive impacts on what people can do in all contexts, and particularly in the urban planning context. So in order to survive and to continue to become relevant, there is a need to reframe the language of urban planning that happens over time, and to redefine the purpose, essentially. So as we start moving towards a couple of more particular case studies, thinking about this need to adapt to survive is important, but also thinking about how planning relates to what ideas of state governance do is really important here as well, which is a historical thing. It's not something, don't tell your urban government's teachers, but you can't really be taught these things outside of historical context because they change all the time. There's no guarantee that the way things are now is going to continue for very long anywhere. And so how this happens mainly is by inflecting the existing language. So thinking about inflections is usually, the easiest way to do that is to, it's a grammatical linguistic term. So you can say the same sentence with the same words two different ways. So we can do, Rebecca, I didn't think I'd see you here.
I'm here every week.
That's true. Or Rebecca, I didn't think I'd see you here. So two sentences, same words, different meanings. One saying that I wouldn't expect to see her in this room, one that I didn't expect to see her as opposed to someone else. And thank you for letting me pick on you. But so that's the concept of inflection. And so you have essentially the same sort of toolbox in a lot of ways, but it becomes inflected more towards facilitating capitalism as opposed to putting the brakes on it. I mean, that's a very broad statement, and that's not to say that you as planners are purely tools of capital. A lot of it depends on whether you're in private practice or in public practice. But it also, the limitation of the public is something that happens not just in planning, it happens everywhere. Which is why I have a picture of the proposed Apple Store for Fed Square here, for example. So this is an example of how difficult it is to have any sense of public good in cities that is not specifically expressed in the language of profits and capitalism. So the idea that something might make money, that's the absolute goal for everything all the time. And it becomes a challenge for people who are working in cities on urban issues to practice in that context. So two big parts of that. The two big neoliberal planning building blocks are the public-private partnership and the language of the stakeholder. So the stakeholder is language that comes out of, historically, comes out of people essentially squatting or going out and colonising land and literally putting stakes in and cordoning off their land. And so the language of the stakeholder has an implication that you hold a stake. You have some kind of asset within you. It's fundamentally capitalist language. And that is the language that shapes the way that participation is seen. So even in the language of the very fabric of the words that are used, the words that we use to describe participation imply that you have access to wealth, even though there is a sort of a need to deal with the reality, which is that a lot of stakeholders don't have that. And the public-private partnership is essentially based on the idea that, which is essentially an ideological belief that has, every year that I've taught anything about neoliberalism, I have always asked, so I'll have to continue to do it, otherwise I'll break a tradition, if anyone ever finds any actual evidence that things done by states are inherently less productive than when they are done by the free market, please let me know, because there are a lot of us who would love to find that information. This is to say that it's inherent to whether or not it's public or private. There are lots of public funded projects that are not effective. There are lots that are. There are lots of private. There's a lot of failures in the market. Just look at Donald Trump's record in terms of the number of business failures he has. But this is the value that's placed on one over the other is completely different. And so when you have a belief that the private sector is better for reasons, then you have a change in how cities are administered, because you create an arbitrary bureaucratic framework built around competition because you're normalising this as a value as well. So, which also creates a lot of work for the state. It's actually much less efficient in terms of money and in terms of practice. But if you look, for example, at the Victorian public housing debates at the moment, where a lot of public housing is going to be demolished and rebuilt under public-private partnerships, any criticism of that, the Victorian government responds with, well, we just can't do that. The state just can't do it. We have to have the private sector involved. If you ask them why, they say it just has to be that way, which is quite interesting. Which goes back to that it's natural framework. So, some more of these things. Building on the issue of Fed Square, the privatisation of the public has been going on since the enclosure of the Commons, at least. So this is not new, but what neoliberalism does is it puts a particular inflection on it. Again, with that word. But it escalates it, and it makes it almost impossible to find spaces that are not spaces for capital, and that are spaces that are not meant to be economically productive. So the language of Fed Square and the proposed Apple store there has often been justified as Fed Square is making a financial loss. So leaving aside the issue of whether or not that's true, because there are debates around that, there is the issue of why does a public square have to make a profit? Why? It's not clear. But it doesn't need to be made clear because it's something that is just believed to be true, because everything should make a profit. Why should universities make a profit? Why should schools make a profit? Why should healthcare make a profit? These are all things that it is just, that have the metrics of profit applied to them as an absolute truth without a huge amount of interrogation. And hostile architecture is one example of how you can see this in a really fine-grained issue. The issue of who should be in a city and where is become really only, say in the last 20 years, become morally acceptable for local governments and for private actors to do things like put spikes down to stop people lying down in front of their building. That's one classic example of hostile architecture. So the City of Melbourne has been very notorious for trying to make its landscape as hostile as possible for homeless people, for example, or for people who are not being economically productive citizens of that city. So hostile architecture, another great example of this is that, you know, those benches that just have arbitrary handles put in the middle of them so that you can't lie down or spread out or just be in public in a way that's comfortable? Because you're not meant to, if you're in the city, you're meant to be buying, you're meant to be spending money, or you're meant to be making money. There aren't really ways to be in public in a neoliberal city that don't involve your economic function. And then this goes down further to the level of the individual. How many people have Fitbit or an equivalent health tracking software? I'll use an example, and I'm fully putting myself up here. I use software that tracks my productivity from a work perspective. that tells me how many hours I spend on my paid work versus my unpaid work. And so that creates data, gives me metrics against which I can try to be more productive. That's conducting yourself like an enterprise. That is conducting yourself according to the rules of market productivity. And it also creates data which can be bought and sold by corporations, and then we get into Facebook data, and that's a wormhole that I'll leave, but you can explore at your own will. And that's quite significant from an urban perspective because it changes how people are regulating their behaviour in an urban space. It changes, once you start adding in issues about data and surveillance, the idea of to what extent the city is a physical space as opposed to a virtual space starts coming into play. And this is where we start getting into the Uberification, which is a word that I hate, but it seems to be getting normalised, so I just have to get over it and use it. But that's a perfect example of neoliberalism in practice. So taxi drivers have spent many years fighting for things like reasonable wages, health and safety, working conditions and so on, which is why they became expensive. Taxi driver unions have been very active historically. The thing is that it makes them expensive, and then people have to pay so that they're being driven by people who have health and safety regulations and who have a first aid kit in their car and so on. What Uber does is that means that you get to bypass that regulation and red tape by hiring someone who doesn't have training and who is using their own car to make money for a large corporation. But it's flexible work, right? So this is flexibility. The rhetoric of neoliberalism, the flexibility has to always come from the individual as opposed to from the top. So Uber is not a flexible corporation, but you as an individual are encouraged to be flexible to accommodate the needs of the corporation and to make money with it. Airbnb is another example of this. So it's only possible to see these as good things if we're at a point where the idea of collective bargaining, health and safety, reasonable wages are considered to be not politically live ideas. So this is why Uber and Airbnb have only really come up fairly recently, economically speaking. And I put this up for fun. Perfect example of neoliberalism in cities is when Elon Musk thinks that he's invented something that has already existed for a long period of time. I find this hilarious and terrifying at the same time. Does anyone follow this thing where he basically thought that he invented the bus? It's very funny. Musk is historically interesting because his antipathy to anything done by collectives or any idea of the social is deeply ingrained in everything that he advocates for and does. So the only solutions he can think of are private sector ones. And so he basically invented a public sector type public transit solution. And then everyone who is left-wing on Twitter laughed at him for that. But the issue is that you could, the ability to think of that as something new relies on a historical context where the idea of doing something for multiple people has to be reframed in a market logic to make sense. And this can apply to a lot of his other ideas as well. But this is as funny as this lecture gets. So it's all down here from here, guys. Okay, specific examples. Hopefully this makes you happy. We're talking about a place that exists. One of the typical touchstones for how to do neoliberal urban planning has become the London Docklands. So do I have I have a mouse, excellent. Down here are the original actual dock buildings. So that was as good an image as I could get. I just didn't want to crop out all the skyscrapers. So down here, these buildings are mainly 19th century buildings. Some are 18th century buildings. A lot of those buildings were built to ship slaves, for example, or to ship various other sort of imperialist goods. And that part of London's docks is a shallow water port. So once you get to a point of containerisation in the 1970s, or 1970, I think it hit the UK, you have to change your port. So those London's shipping moved to Tilbury and somewhere else. But they had to ship their stuff elsewhere. You couldn't get stuff this far up the Thames anymore. So you have all these buildings and all this area that had traditionally, for a very long period of time, had a lot of the working class community who worked there, lived in the immediate areas. If anyone else watches EastEnders, this is the kind of culture that they're partly associated with. You get to laugh at me now, that's okay, but it's a great show. But there is a particular kind of industrial economy that was associated with that part of the East End. When the docks move off, some people move with them, but not everyone can. And you've also got a lot of vacant real estate in the heart of London. So there were a number of attempts in the 70s to do something with that. However, it was just very difficult to do anything in the 1970s that involved a lot of capital. The story of the 1970s in Britain is of things like airports, motorways, new towns, and things like that getting cancelled, except for Milton Keynes. Pretty much everything else got put off for at least 10 years. So Stansted Airport is one example of that. And then, so nothing really gets off the ground in the 70s. And then Thatcher comes along. And Thatcher has the problem of an extremely left-wing London government, London local government. And so partly, and this is documented in the archives, she sort of wants to show them who's boss, literally. And so what she does is she creates the London Docklands Development Corporation. So it uses the language of the post-war Welfare State Development Corporation, but it's very different. It's basically a clearinghouse to sell the London Docklands land to the highest bidder, and to create and to remake that economic centre of London. Essentially, it's designed to show off what capital can do when there is no regulation. So there are tax breaks, there is, in terms of building codes and things like that, all the kinds of planning requirements which you might otherwise have are not in existence there. Sam Weatherall has done a really interesting article on how this can be seen as a capitalist-type co-optation of the non-plan ideas from week 6. I won't try and summarise it because that would be doing him a disservice. It's a very good article. I have a link to it in the further reading. It's also open access, so you can share it with your friends. Because I assume that's what you do. That's what I do. So maybe I shouldn't do. But as an example of how left ideas of deregulation and resistance to authoritarian or paternalist rule can be transformed into the language of essentially a right-wing libertarian view in favour of enterprise and individualistic capital. And this model is something that you can see in waterfront renewals that have similar historical contexts all over the world. And this is where the fact that Britain hit particular economic moments first makes it interesting and useful for looking at historical models, because they dealt with things first, and so they become a sort of a reference point for how to do things either properly or not. So the Melbourne Docklands example shares a lot of features with this. It's not entirely the same, but as a framework, in order to when you look at the problems of Melbourne's Docklands, which generally involve a lack of all of the social infrastructure that would have been in place had urban planning that is been permitted to be involved to the extent that most urban planners would want, at the expense of having speculative developers have that level of power. It's a similar sort of framework of problems. Okay, this is a nice general one. Interestingly, I wanted to take a photo of my own avocado toast for this, but I couldn't afford any last week. So there's a little slice of neoliberalism for you. So I had to use the stock photo, my apologies. Also, I can't afford a proper phone, so my phone camera is pretty bad, so it would have been an extra, just layers of neoliberalism for you on my toast. But instead, we have this stock photo. So, I assume everyone remembers this. For those of you who don't, I envy you for not having to deal with this, because it was very infuriating. But the idea, it started in Australia, this particular furor, based on various right-wing columnists blaming the housing crisis, defined as the crisis of middle-class people not being able to purchase housing. So that's one very specific definition of housing crisis. But blaming that on the way in which millennials, or people who are generally younger, are spending too much money on frivolities like expensive toast. Which is interesting because avocado toast is usually one of the cheapest things on the menu. At most cafes anyway. So what this does, and the reason this got such sort of horror and humour on one side, and such vehement agreement from people on the other side, is that it sort of fractures a lot of really interesting generational experiences about capitalism and about cities and how they work, and about ideas of housing as well. So it's actually a really good case study for looking at the intersection of a lot of different social and political ideas. So firstly, we have the idea that if you have a house that you've won somehow. So housing in this framework is not something that everyone is entitled to, but it's something that is a signifier of some kind of success, that you've conducted yourself as an enterprise in an effective enough way to be housed. Then we have the idea that the housing crisis in Australia in particular can be defined as a crisis of people being able to purchase homes, which is largely middle-class people who want to obtain an asset, a large asset. That's a very specific way of defining a crisis. It does not include, for example, the number of people who cannot obtain housing. It does not include the people who are on public housing waiting lists, which continue to get longer and longer. So it's a crisis narrowly defined for a small group of people. And it's also a crisis which helps to emphasise the difference in experiences between different generations of people. So people who worked and accumulated their wealth under a time period where they did not have to deal with the full extent of neoliberal economic policies, generally had a much easier time of accumulating their wealth because it was structurally simpler to do. So I graduated in 2007. That was not a good time to finish a degree, I tell you that. It was also not a good time to move to England, but that's another story. Because it was really bad there, really bad. So there's a moment at which the experience of people in wealth accumulation and in work stability changes fairly drastically. And this is really a divide that it affects early. This is where the term millennial is ridiculous. But there are people, say, under 40 who have a very different experience of capitalism than people older than that. At the same time, people who did have that different experience still have all the neoliberal cultural beliefs about individual enterprise. So if you need help, then it's essentially your fault in a neoliberal framework. If you are experiencing difficulty in your experience of the competition, then that's not necessarily due to the fact that competitions can't have everyone win, which is a very blunt way of putting it. But I do that deliberately because it can be very hard to cut through this language of nature and just how things are. And so the idea that the economy is structured in a way that is becoming harder and harder for people to obtain social markers of status is something that's becoming quite important and is a historically significant thing for post-global financial crisis cities, particularly because it's not really going away as an issue, but the language with which it's being expressed is constantly changing. So these are, in order to understand the ridiculousness of these types of historical events, I mean, laughing at them is one thing, and getting annoyed at them is another, but also understanding what they're actually telling us about the expectations of who is meant to be, what kinds of places people are meant to occupy, let's lowercase o, occupy, in, not just in cities, but in state structures of economies is really important. Okay, so having just talked about 2007, so a lot of people didn't remember 1997. Did anyone remember just the sort of throes of the global financial crisis from 2007? It was pretty bad. I remember just not being able to get a job. It was really bad. Maybe if we ask the neoliberals, that was my fault. But you could also say that it was because there had just been a major crisis of capitalism that was specifically derived from speculative investment around housing as well. The interesting thing about this is that for all of the significance of this as a financial crisis is that as much as it led to things like the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, various kinds of social uprising, capitalism's still going. And a lot of people at the time, who we could loosely call accelerationists, sort of had the thing of like, aha, crisis of capitalism is here. Now we don't need to do any work. Everything is going to change. It sort of didn't. We're in an interesting historical phase of neoliberalism. It could be described as neoliberalism rebooted or reasserted. Jeremy Peck calls it zombie neoliberalism, which is great fun, in the sense that it's sort of staggering on. It's not quite dead, but it's definitely terrifying and it's coming after you. That's maybe a slightly oversimplification of the article, which I've put in the readings. But the thing is that neoliberalism is a version of capitalism, and capitalism is fantastically good at adapting to contradictions and to presenting itself as natural, because it relies on rhetoric of what is natural. You can only really have a revolution or a new system come into play if you believe that the current system is not just dead, but that there's something else to replace it. If we're remembering back to the 1970s model, there was a belief that there was a way to go back. If you've been told for 35, 40 years that there is no alternative and we can't go back, then people don't believe they can go back, but they also don't necessarily have a clearly articulated structure of what could come next. It's very hard to work out who actually said this first. Mark Fisher has been attributed as the source of this. However, Frederick Jameson said it earlier. But the fact that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism is quite significant here, I think, because trying to think of what can happen next in a very interesting historical period that we're in, where there are sort of fragments in neoliberal consensuses, but everything seems to be ticking over, it's quite difficult to actually predict. And this is the other issue, is that ideologies don't have to be logical to work. In fact, they're probably more likely to work if they can contain some logical inconsistencies, because then you can appeal to a larger group of people. So it's interesting to see some sort of like old left type figures like Sanders, Corbyn, even Sally McManus here, sort of adapting and trying to articulate new ways of being. But it's not quite an ascendancy of any kind. But people trying to find the language of resisting neoliberalism is something you can see playing out on a sort of day-by-day basis, which is quite an interesting thing to follow. This is quite an interesting body of theory which I raise because the universal basic income is something that is often put forward as a next step out of neoliberalism and out of capitalism. This also gave me the excuse to put up one of the most hilarious phrases I've ever heard, which is fully automated luxury communism. It's also great fun to say, so I recommend just giving it a try from that basis. But there are a lot of interesting theoretical works that are trying to engage with how can we fix this being everything that we're in now, and particularly everything in the post-2007 neoliberal political economic order, and also in cities specifically. And the two main prongs of that are on trying to work out a way that automation can be harnessed for the benefit of society at large, as opposed to concentrating profit for capital. The problem with that is that it tends to sort of use an accelerationist logic, which is basically that the crisis of capitalism is supposedly inevitable and that it's just going to die at some point. Good luck with that. To be perfectly frank, capitalism is very good at not collapsing completely. We've had it for a long time. It's continually reinventing itself. That seems to be the thing that happens. And there can be a sort of fatalism to this belief in accelerationism, which can be a problem. But the idea of how to deal with the changing nature of labour is fundamentally an urban issue. So that's why it's an important thing to be thinking about and exploring. Universal basic income is the second one. I've linked to a bunch of debates from Overland's journal in the further reading, which is a very interesting exploration of the for and against universal basic income, because essentially while creating a situation where everyone, regardless of their productivity, is able to survive, that can sound like a way out of these issues of magnifying inequality that happen under the competitive system of neoliberalism. It's not impossible that neoliberalism could use it as a tool to justify further inequality on the basis of making labour itself into a luxury. It could be used to magnify competitive behaviours as opposed to removing it. So it essentially relies on who's in charge of it. And I had to put it up there. These debates are creepily similar to all the stuff that happens in the 19th century as automation becomes a thing. So E.P. Thompson was debating all this stuff as a historian 50 years ago, and it's creepily similar, like to the point that it feels like you're reading a time traveller writing about these things. But this is an important thing to think about. Often people do this thing where they have to reinvent the wheel. Issues about automation have been analysed pretty deeply at this point. So drawing on that is a helpful way of understanding. So, some conclusions, not all of them. We are in neoliberalism, if you want to use that as a term. Obviously, I sort of do, because that's why I've spent a lot of time talking about it. You don't have to, but there's something going on in capitalism that is a bit different to other forms, and that is shaping the forms of the state, and that is shaping the context in which cities function, and it's shaping the context in which planners function. So if you want to use another word like late capitalism or whatever, welcome, but there is a need to think about the historical specificities of this thing. And it creates massive questions about what the discipline of urban planning is going to continue to do and to look like. That we don't know what that's going to be. And it may not, that's not even a static thing of like it's going to change into one thing. Things are going to continue to change, and it's all going to be very interesting. Maybe interesting will be a euphemism for catastrophe. Sometimes people say interesting when they mean terrible. Sometimes interesting just means interesting. But the issue is to think about what are the historical factors that are shaping what you do, and who has thought about this before, what hasn't been thought about before, and how can we adapt the skills that we have to drive change. Now, on Wednesday, there's a strike? Because Melbourne University is a fantastic neoliberal institution, and that has implications for things like not getting paid very much. There is a strike on Wednesday between 9 and 1. Everyone is welcome to come to the rally which is being held on, the week late May Day rally for this year for all union activity, so it's the Change the Rules rally. Most of the classes that you're in won't be affected for this subject. Check with your other subjects though, they may be affected. If your staff are not taking industrial action, you may want to ask them why. These are up in your slides. The union has suggested we put this up. But it's worth thinking about the benefits of collective action in a society that is designed to atomise us. Here is some reading. If you can't find any of these, email me. Some of them are a little bit tricky to find. I've put marks up here because the fragment on machines is something that comes up a lot in theories of neoliberalism. It's just a little bit of a discovered draft of Capital, so you don't have to read the whole thing. But it comes up in a lot of debates. And these are the UBI references I was discussing. Does anyone have any questions, things, points, thoughts, wonderings? Just want to get out of here? That's okay too. Well, feel free to email me if you have any questions going forward, or you can just come and crash my tutorial. I'm always happy with that as well. But let's get out of here a little bit early then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lauren.
You said the idea of, was it public working better than private? Yeah, I just wondered whether, and I feel like Rebecca might have to say about this, but so like, well, just this, like specifically Japan, do you think the fact that like the metro system in Japan is private, do you think that might be something like
It's not to say that private can't be extremely efficient, but it's the belief that if it's automatically less efficient because it's public.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I wonder about, and that doesn't, and as a broad theoretical.
Yeah.
Really good thing,
but I just thought.
that would be great tutorial discussion.
Okay, right. I'm not in Becca's. I'm in James's.
Oh, James.
Yeah. I just wonder whether. Right. Okay, makes sense. Yeah. Because like I realised that you were talking more about it in terms of theory, but I wonder whether or not that's like a good example of.
Absolutely, and looking at exceptions to these kinds of rules is crucial to help tightening everything up.
Right. Yeah.
But also just thinking about why is it so productive? Is it because of the ownership, or is it because of other things about the administration?
I think Japan's a bit unique it's unique in so many different ways.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of hard to take it out of context. But
Japanese neoliberalism is so interesting because of the way it. And that's why I use that word inflection, because it has a different cultural inflection.
Yeah, definitely.
But it still has a lot of the neoliberal stuff in it.
Yeah.
So,
definitely.
God, that would be a good tutorial.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've done a bit of, actually, I took an exchange to Japan and studied, I managed to study,
fun.
Yeah, it was great. I managed to study urban planning, some urban planning subjects over there.
Oh my God,
as well,
I'm
which
so
was
jealous.
really cool.
That would have been amazing.
But yeah, my lecturer of that subject, who was German, but like studying, he was, his thing was privately owned public space.
Yeah,
And
that's perfect for this.
Yeah. It's I'm looking at doing like an honours thesis equivalent next year.
Fantastic. That sounds really cool.
And eventually, sort of do research, and that's kind of something that I'm quite interested in. Sort of the concept of privately owned public space.
Well, James is definitely going to be a great resource for that in particular. But the further reading slides do have some starting points for that. So
all right.
I'd like to say have a look at them now. But if you download them and then
store
them
which
for...
ones specifically? I can just have a look and see. But,
Actually, there's something else I'm thinking of which might help.
Okay.
Peter Limbaugh's book, Stop Thief,
okay.
is an interesting book about the enclosure of the commons and a long historical perspective.
Okay.
And with a title like that, you can tell that it's going to be extremely polemical,
Yeah.
but in an interesting way.
Okay. Stop thief.
Yeah, but anything like looking at it from the perspective of the enclosure of the commons would be really interesting.
Right.
Paul Mason's a bit weird, but
Okay.
he has some interesting ideas about this as well, and his references are good. So
Okay.
a lot of the stuff I put up is stuff that might be a little bit wacky, but
Right.
if it's theoretically grounded wacky.
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no, there's nothing more boring than just having stuff up that you agree with.
Right.
Completely.
Yeah, no, definitely. I
But
think so.
those are such great. You're going to have a really fun tutorial. For those sorts
Okay,
of
awesome.
situations. Yeah, no. And James in particular will have loads of things to interact with as well.
Yeah, okay. I might ask him about that. Sweet, yeah. I recently read Andy May's book.
Fantastic. Which one? Is that the Street
The
Life?
Melbourne, the Street Life one.
Yeah, the one that just got back in print.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
Yeah, and that was kind of, it was really, I talked to him like last week about potentially supervising me for a thesis.
He's an amazing supervisor. He was my PhD
Oh,
supervisor.
okay, yeah. He seems like an amazing...
He is really, like there's a particular set of skills, but actually just the supervising stuff, he can do that so well.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah, and he's supervised such a range of stuff.
Okay.
And he's such a nice guy. And
Yeah,
that really
he
helps.
seems so lovely.
But yeah, no, I'm always trying to get people to read Andy's work here.
Okay,
so
yeah.
it's like a dream when someone
It's a
does.
great book.
I know, he's very readable.
And it's hilarious as well. Like the chapter on animals, I was
Yes.
just like laughing my
His
whole
stuff on
way.
public toilets is
Yeah.
amazing.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's great. Yeah.
So that's really cool. But I'll have a think,
Okay.
and I'll let James know if I think of anything else that might specifically
Okay.
help, because
Cool. Yeah, that would
this
be
is
great.
exactly the kind of thing we want to encourage.
Okay. Yeah. I'm actually. I'm not doing a. I'm secretly in here. I'm
Good.
still finishing my undergrad.
Good.
But like I'm enrolled in the subject.
Yeah.
But I'm just
No, that's good.
doing this on the side to improve.
Excellent.
my history.
Well, now, especially now that because there's no money, we don't have a chance to do this stuff over in history. It's
Right. Oh, okay.
You know, because
right.
there's
Yeah, true.
It's just the money thing.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's neoliberalism is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder. Yeah.
It is a
So.
little bit, well, because it's all about market demand. And
Yeah.
stuff.
And is this not available like as an elective for? Because this is only for like planning students, isn't it?
Yeah, and
I have no idea. I have no idea from year to year who gets to access things and who doesn't. And
and it's not necessarily very well communicated to
Yeah,
us.
no,
one way
it's
or the
not.
other. But I'm glad you made it here, one way or the
Yeah.
other.
Yeah. No, I did. It was on James's recommendation.
If you name drop me to Andy,
Okay.
that will give him clues, because
Even-
he's had to put up with me a lot for the last 5 years. So
Okay. So is it a good thing if I mention your name? Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
And also,
Perfect.
well, just in the sense of he'll know where
Right, where I am.
you're coming from.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's great.
And my thesis is
is
under
that still recording, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay,
Possibly.
Yeah, it is.
because I think you've got to physically turn it off.
Yeah, but it wasn't working, so I was letting it automatically do it.
Okay.
But hello, everyone.
Yeah. Hi. Good.
Yeah, I should have thought about that.
Yeah.
My thesis is still under embargo, but if you
Okay.
would like a copy, do let me know, because
Yeah, that would be interesting.
sometimes having a look at theses that have been supervised by someone who
Yeah, that would be.
it's actually quite a helpful tool when you're thinking about these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. Should I email you?
Yeah, because I'll forget.
Yeah.
And that way I can have your email as
Yeah.
well. So,
Okay.
but
Sweet. Yeah,
yeah.
that would be great. Cool.
Thanks
Thank
very
you
much.
so much.
No problem.
I love your shirt, by the way.
Oh, thank you. It's online. Yeah. I just I was just asking. I don't know if
Yes.
you have any opinions on this, but the
Me too,
example
probably.
of probably because it's about Japan. The idea of like public versus like whether or not privately owned is like inherently better. or not.
A lot of my thesis is kind of going in that direction.
Yeah.
I don't have a clear answer, but
But I was just wondering if you think that the metro in Japan would be an example.
it's a really
privately.
complicated one, and I get,
Yeah.
like, when I talk about that, I get, obviously really different and very striking opinions from different people in transport usually.
Right, yeah.
Someone like Crystal finds it horrifying because she's adamantly against, that sort of privatisation of
Yeah.
markets.
Yeah.
And then other people are like, well, but actually look at the outcomes.
Yeah.
It works well. I think privatisation works well in Japan. I used to live. I think it works well. in
Yeah,
Japan,
I
but-
mean, it has a lot of, it
Yeah.
has worked well in a lot of ways for sure.
But whether or
And-
not it would work in Australia would be a different.
Yeah.
And
That's
and
just the
it's
thing.
very much, I mean, as Lauren would probably say, and I think as was kind of going up here, it depends on what your aims are. Like, what are you hoping to achieve with it?
Yeah.
What do you imagine is possible?
Yeah.
I mean, if your aim is to destroy capitalism, then that's not going to help you very much. But if your aim is to get some better sort of community benefits and accessibility
Yeah.
benefits from
Yeah.
within a system like that, then,
Yeah.
then it may be something that works well. But the thing I would always say is that it's still got to be highly regulated. And that's very much
That's
what I talk
exactly
about
what I
in
was
the...
just
Yeah.
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 That's, a lot of my PhD is on parking and I'm always talking about, it's a market-based system, so I'm always advocating for that. And I always have to say, of course, my real feelings on this in a broader sense are,
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But nevertheless,
In the
relatively
sense of Japan.
speaking,
Yeah.
let's look at how this works. But my answer always is Japan's system is not just a market-based system.
Yeah.
It is a highly regulated and a very specifically regulated market system,
Yes.
which has benefits and
Yeah.
disbenefits. And
There's a lot of
That's
chains
what
in
I
it,
find.
actually, when you think about it. And I don't know that that's necessarily deliberate,
Yeah.
but like the correlation versus causation in this stuff is where it gets interesting, because it's not to say that things can't be good or bad, but
Yeah.
what is making it that way.
Yeah.
And it may very well be that the regulation is what does it, so you can have a highly regulated market-based model.
yeah, and you've got to
Maybe.
look specifically at what kind of regulation you want. I mean, I would
Absolutely.
say again and I'm talking about parking, sorry, but that's my thing. But in their parking system, again, what I argue is that there's almost, as you know, there's almost no on-street car parking. There's
Yeah.
a very 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 small amount of it. So in a sense, that's a spatial regulation because they've gone. The market does not enter here in this way. In other ways, yes.
And
but in
also
this way,
space is such a commodity. Like it's
Yeah.
so precious.
yeah,
in
so
some
you,
ways.
in a lot of ways, you get better public ownership of space, and yeah, I think for in the sense of parking, for various reasons, that works really well. So it's all within, the private system of land in a way, and also it shifts, that shifts it so that the responsibility is with drivers, individual homeowners, and real estate agents rather than the government. So the government sets the boundaries, goes, I guess, do what you want from within here,
Yeah.
and we will focus on public transport and all of those other sorts of things.
Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know that much about actual planning regulations in Japan. Only really more like the design side of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
It'd be interesting. So because a lot of it, is the land still owned by the emperor? I can't remember. What's the deal with that?
Maybe there's some land owned by him, but I don't know that sort of.
It's not like British stuff where it's like all owned by the Queen, is it? It's like
No, I mean it's a pretty. It's very similar here in terms of just the amount of land that's just within individual private ownership.
Right.
And there are a lot of similarities with what people are able to do and what the state can.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria. And I will be the leader. No? That's for the game. Oh, that's not the game first one. It's finished. It's finished. That almost a good finished. It's not an more fancier.